Welcome to Voices of the Community, which explores critical issues facing Northern California communities. We introduce you to the voices of community thought leaders and change makers who are working on solutions that face our fellow individual community members, neighborhoods, cities, and our region. This is George Koster, your host. This episode is part of our series exploring COVID-19's impact on nonprofits and small businesses in San Francisco. We started the series back in April of 2020 during the height of the first phase of the COVID-19 pandemic and the shelter-in-place requirements. Over these past 9 months, the COVID-19 pandemic and economic meltdown has wiped out millions of jobs in both the nonprofit and small business sectors, as well as shuttered tens of thousands of small business operations. The goal of the series is to shine a spotlight on the nonprofits, small businesses, and their staff who are struggling to deal with the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on their operations, services, and sustainability. The series of interviews we conducted features voices from a cross-section of organizations that make up the fabric of our community. Each of them brings a unique perspective on how they and we are dealing with the issues facing our community during the global pandemic and economic depression.
I do hope that this crisis has created an opportunity for nonprofit boards to think about their structure, to think about their partner organizations, and to imagine how they might change the way they look and operate to create more impact in the future. The big question mark in my head is duration. It's, again, this question of how long does this crisis last?
In this episode, our featured voices are Jacob Harold, the Executive Vice President, and Anna Koob, the Director of Data Standards of Candid. Back in April of 2020, when we decided to create this series on COVID-19's impact first on nonprofits and then on small businesses in the San Francisco Bay Area, we, like you, had no idea how long the pandemic would go on and what the health and economic impact would be on our community. Over these past 9 months, we've talked to over 33 nonprofits and small businesses about how COVID-19 and the subsequent economic meltdown is impacting their ability to continue to provide services and products as well as to just survive. We wanted to end 2020 hosting an interview with Jacob and Anna and ask them to walk us through their findings, insights, and recommendations from their published national and state analysis on how many nonprofits will shut down because of the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm joined remotely via Zoom by Jacob Harold, the Executive Vice President, and Anna Koob, the Director of Data Standards of Candid. Thanks for being here, Jacob and Anna. So, Jacob, I want to turn to you and please provide the audience a little background on who is Candid.
Sure, George. It's great to be here. So Candid was formed in February of 2019 by the merger of Foundation Center and GuideStar. So in a way, we're just under 2 years old, but in another way, we're 80 years old when we look at the combined history of the two parent organizations. So we're in this odd moment of being a startup and an institution that's been around for a while. And on both of those time horizons, our goal is to get people the information they need to do good. And we do that through a variety of different mechanisms, online and in person. And we've got billions of pieces of data that are used by tens of millions of people each year, ranging from information about individual nonprofit organizations to trainings about fundraising practice to data about foundation grants, mostly in the US, but also around the world. And so we're trying to figure out who we're going to be when we grow up. And it's a pretty exciting moment, although obviously 2020 has been a strange year as we continue the process of becoming a single organization, bringing together these two histories of Foundation Center and GuideStar.
Thank you. That was great. I think the audience would love to hear a little brief background on both of you before we lead into the amazing study you've done on COVID impact on nonprofits. So Anna, would you like to start?
Certainly. I'm Anna Koob, a research director at Candid. And in that role, my job is to make meaning of the billions of data points that we're collecting annually about nonprofit organizations and foundation grant making.
And Jacob?
Sure. So I was the president and CEO of GuideStar at the time of the merger, and my current role is as executive vice president. And in that, I'm leading our Insights division, which is our research division, but really trying to go beyond that, as Anna says, to find meaning in all this data and to weave that meaning into a story that makes sense to people both within and outside of the nonprofit sector.
And so the reason I brought you both together today, I've been doing this whole series on COVID-19's impact on nonprofits in the San Francisco Bay Area. And I read your recent blog post on Candid's weekly newsletter, highly recommended to everybody who's interested in nonprofits and foundations. And you've done an amazing job of providing the kind of insights into the actual impact of COVID-19 on the nonprofit sector. So, Jacob, I'm going to start with you and have you provide some context and criteria of the study itself.
Absolutely. So, we were around late March, early April, we started getting a pretty scary question, which is how many nonprofits are going to go out of business because of this crisis? And that's the kind of question that you don't want to hear, but we were hearing it a lot, and we knew that it was on the minds of a lot of folks across the social sector. And we also knew we couldn't predict the future, but we took a moment and we said, how could our data help people at least begin to answer that question and plan in this time of uncertainty what some of the potential scenarios might look like? Now, it's worth highlighting that things have gotten even more complicated since March or April, with the racial equity uprising, with the election, change around the world. It's not just about COVID-19 and the economic crisis that it brought on. But when we look at the drivers of potential nonprofit closures, I think the economic crisis brought on by the pandemic is the most important one. And so we were lucky that lots of other partner organizations were doing surveys and beginning to ask this question, providing some data points that could feed into an analysis. And so we thought, we think we can come up with something that will be useful. And Anna and her team led that process.
Thank you. And to turn to you, Anna, and kind of walk us through the research. Your analysis, is really based on the financial future of the nonprofits. Very in depth. I think you did 10 million computations?
Right. So as Jacob says, we can't predict the future. So I think there's kind of a dose of humility that is pretty central to what we try to undertake here. But given the vast quantities of data that we are sitting on as Candid, we're in a position to make some projections. So for this projection-based analysis, we looked at the most recent IRS filings for about 315,000 US-based public charities. And we really focused on some kind of key fiscal figures. So we looked at cash on hand, annual revenue, and different revenue streams for organizations. So distinguishing between, contributed revenue in the form of donations, foundation grants, distinct from revenue earned from program services or sales. And then we also considered the annual expenses for each of these 300,000 plus organizations. So we then introduced a number of scenarios, 20 to be exact, by which expenses and revenue might change over a specific time frame, which we call months of disruption. And these 20 scenarios represent a pretty wide range, I'd say, from the dire scenario of a sort of a long time horizon for economic instability, economic recession with, associated large hits to organizational revenue. And then the other end of the spectrum from these more dire scenarios are a bit more optimistic, a shorter timeline, 9 months or so, along with sort of organizational ability to adjust their expenses to respond to the hits in revenue. So under each of these scenarios, we calculated the number of organizations that would go out of business, sort of exhaust their cash reserves, go beyond the revenue that they were able to collect. And we found that in the median scenario among these 20, estimated that about 7% of nonprofits would close as a result of the pandemic.
And I think your worst case was something like 38%.
That's right. So that used, I think, a 3-year time horizon with pretty significant hits to revenue, I think as much as 40% in some cases, with kind of a concurrent reduction in expenses, sort of assuming that nonprofits might be able to also cut their expenses by about 25%, I think, in that most dire case.
Thank you. So, Jacob, I'm going to have you share with us how the scenario planning worked. What were the 20 possible scenarios based on? One of my favorite scenarios was the miracle scenario as well, which, so much of this time period is based on that one.
It's true. Yeah. So, as Anna said, we wanted to offer a range of different possibilities. And, a key metric in all this is how long is this going to last? And our scenarios range from 9 months in the miracle scenario, which is basically about where we're at right now. It's December and it started in March, all the way up to 36 months of disruption. And I'll just say that, now 6 months after we did this analysis, it looks like we're probably looking at a total disruption period of between 18 and 24 months on the assumption that the vaccine really comes into play early next year and that we're back to normal, quote unquote, third quarter or so of next year. So in a way, that is a bit of an affirmation of our analysis because that's right about in the middle of the different durations that we looked at. But we also wanted to look at how this would affect different types of nonprofit business models. As Anna said, we were looking at, a range of different revenue impacts. And we also needed to have a baseline because nonprofits go out of business each year no matter what's happening. So 6 of the scenarios are actually baseline scenarios where we're trying to estimate what might have happened in the absence of the pandemic. And the median of the set of baseline scenarios we looked at was about 12,000 of these 315,000. I think it's important to keep in mind that some nonprofits going out of business is a natural part of the dynamism of the social sector. The scary news is that as we modeled scenarios where there really was a drop in revenue and this lasted a long time, we did see up to 119,000 of these 315,000 nonprofits just running out of money. And those extremes are probably less relevant than what we see in the middle. And there were 9 of the scenarios that felt particularly feasible to us, in part because they were based directly on some of the survey research that our partner organizations had done, who had actually gone out and asked hundreds of nonprofits, hey, what sort of hit are you seeing to your donations? What sort of drop are you seeing in your earned revenue? Are you adjusting your expenses? Now, every one of those surveys, we collected dozens of them, was aimed at a particular sector or subset part of the sector, a particular type of nonprofit, a particular country, a particular size. So none of them gave us a perfect answer as to what was actually happening to nonprofits. But they did show us a range of different possibilities and help to inform the estimates that we put into place. Where, I'll just pick one at random. Scenario number 9 assumes that this lasts 36 months, that service revenue goes down by an average of 15%, that contributed revenue actually stays flat because people continue to be generous, investment revenue down 10%, sales revenue down 20%, and that nonprofits cut their expenses by 15%. In that scenario, we're looking at 23,000 nonprofits going out of business, which would be 11,000 more than we would have expected. So that's just an example of one of the potential scenarios that we looked at. And, it will be a really interesting exercise in a couple of years to go back and really see where did things actually land. But I will say, my hunch is that we may end up somewhere around the median, which was 34,000 nonprofits going out of business, which would be 22,000 more than one would expect. One other thing I'll just highlight here is that the 315,000 nonprofits we did this analysis on were the ones where we have really good data. And they represent the vast majority of activity and employment in the nonprofit sector, but they don't represent every nonprofit. There are tiny, tiny nonprofits out there that are mostly volunteer-led where we don't have a lot of data. And so, those are harder to speak to, but, we also know that, they are feeling the impacts of this crisis as well.
What I also found interesting about the study was you broke it into essentially issues. And so some of the issues that seem to be hit harder, health, for example, arts and culture, and housing. Could you, Jacob, speak a little bit about this as to why you think a specific issue might be hit harder than another?
Absolutely. And, it all comes down to business model, and that different nonprofit categories lend themselves to different kinds of business models. So, for example, arts organizations naturally lend themselves to a mixture of earned and contributed revenue because they have the opportunity of ticket sales, whether that's to a museum or, to the opera or to a hip hop performance. So there is an opportunity for some earned income, which has really been wiped out in this strange year that we've been in. But most of these organizations also rely on contributed income. That's going to be different than a nonprofit that maybe is 100% reliant on contributed income, especially if that comes from, say, foundations that are more likely to maintain operations and maintain a similar level of giving. So we wanted to capture, at least partially, the varying impacts that you might see across these issue areas. Now, even within arts organizations or health organizations, there's a wide variety of different potential business models, but they do tend to cluster around a particular model. And one thing that I should highlight is that, with the tens of millions of calculations we did to come up with this analysis, we actually were looking individually at each of those 315,000 nonprofits. So we weren't looking on average, we were looking at each one and their particular financial circumstances applied to each of these scenarios. So the aggregate number captures some of that variety, but we definitely know that, the reality is that this is going to play out differently for different types of nonprofits.
Thank you. Great insights. I'm going to turn back to you, Anna, and ask, so here we are at a low of, it appears like 12 to as many as 30 plus thousand nonprofits that could close. Could you share with the audience what you feel like the impact of the closings of these nonprofits would have on local communities, people being served, and then both on the national and local economy?
Certainly. So I think, very simply put, nonprofits matter in communities and people depend on their services, whether it be sort of a homeless shelter or an organization providing housing services, food banks, et cetera. So I think, to the extent that organizations providing valuable services that people depend on are closing or need to significantly cut back their services, people will be affected and will suffer. In terms of employment, the nonprofit sector employs about 13 million people nationally, and already others have done great research. Johns Hopkins Center for Civil Society Studies regularly puts out figures about job losses in the sector and the sort of anemic recovery since March of nonprofit jobs. So certainly this has an effect on the overall economy as well as an individual human cost of those who are losing their jobs.
Thank you. Jacob, I'm going to turn back to you only because one of the things I loved about the study was it wasn't just like, hi, here's all the bad news, good luck. It was, here's lots of bad news, and then here are some strategies that you guys have identified that the nonprofit sector and all of the proverbial ecosystem of support around them, government, foundations, individuals, et cetera, could do. So could you speak a little bit about the collaboration idea or restructuring? I was reading, as I mentioned, the article with Ford issuing debt to give more money, which I thought was a wonderful idea. Hopefully more foundations do that. But please share with us some of the identified solutions or strategies that you would suggest.
It has been quite encouraging to see the creativity and innovation that's come out of the nonprofit sector and funders over the last few months. And I think a big question is, how much of that will last? You mentioned foundations are changing behavior in a number of ways, most dramatically borrowing billions of dollars so that they can give more, taking advantage of their balance sheets to tap the capital markets to bring in more money to do good in this hard time. It's an incredible innovation, in my opinion. You've also seen foundations just change their practice, shifting to more general operating support, being more flexible, extending deadlines for reports, et cetera, just recognizing the reality of work on the ground right now. And then you've seen nonprofits be really creative on both the fundraising side and the programmatic side, whether that's an arts organization figuring out how to do online shows that are still meaningful to people, or a jazz nonprofit in New York doing online happy hours with some of their supporters. And then on the programmatic side, food banks completely restructuring the way that they distribute food in ways that have been really important for countless Americans. So there has been real innovation. To me, the big question is how much structural innovation will last. And the best example of structural innovation is mergers and acquisitions, when organizations truly change their underlying legal structure. Now, we at Candid can speak to both the power of that and that it is not easy. It is a very significant undertaking to do that. But I do hope that this crisis has created an opportunity for nonprofit boards to think about their structure, to think about their partner organizations, and to imagine how they might change the way they look and operate to create more impact in the future. The big question mark in my head is duration. It's, again, this question of how long does this crisis last? Because I think if you had told nonprofit board members the summer of 2020, this is going to be a 3-year crisis, they would have had a very different kind of conversation. But I think many nonprofits were prone to a hope that, this will all be over early next year. We can go right back to normal. So to me, there is still this question mark of whether this will last long enough and people will know that it's going to last long enough to really spur on those sort of bigger structural conversations. So we'll see. But, my hope is that, some of that innovation can make up for the very real suffering that we've seen in the sector this year.
Some great insights there. Final question for both of you, and I'll start with you, Anna, and that is, what are some of the positive things that you could see coming out of the pandemic and economic crisis to support the nonprofit sector?
So I'll pick up on one point that Jacob mentioned, which is about foundation practice. So I think there has been an acknowledgement for years that, reduced reporting requirements, flexible funding, essentially funding practices that give nonprofits kind of more leeway, more control over how they allocate the funding that they receive from foundations. These have been talking points, and there's been acknowledgement that there should be, normative shifts should happen here. But I think we are seeing preliminary evidence this year that foundations are starting to walk the walk here a bit. So in no small part, thanks to the Council on Foundations pledge calling on funders to do these very things, increase their payout amounts, reduce reporting requirements, these sorts of things. So I think that's certainly a positive shift that we can see sort of how long the lasting legacy of this year's shifts are. And then the other thing I would point to is kind of the rise of mutual aid. We work at Candid, which certainly a lot of the data we're collecting is about sort of the institutional nature of social good in the US. But I think by no means is social good limited to the nonprofit sector. And so seeing the rise of mutual aid networks, the solidarity-based, community-based support, and, providing things like grocery delivery and rent relief for neighbors is a really positive development, I'd say, that really complements the nonprofit sector.
Thank you. And then Jacob, same question. What are some of the great things that you could see coming out?
Well, I'll build on what Anna mentioned with mutual aid. Is I just think this has forced a reconsideration of the roles of all institutions in our society. And that I think the power and importance of the nonprofit sector has become very clear when we see photos of long lines of people in their cars waiting to pick up food from a food bank. It's a very stark, very visual reminder of how important the nonprofit sector is. I think we've also been reminded that there are some things that only government can do. That the scale of economic stimulus that's been offered, the nonprofit sector simply isn't big enough to do that. And so we've been reminded of the importance of government. And similarly, that there are certain businesses, I'm thinking about grocery stores, that are just essential for our lives and are capable of doing certain things at scale that also the nonprofit sector can't do. And so this crisis has reminded us of the important critical role of all parts of society, of the nonprofit sector, of mutual aid networks, of government, of business. And I hope has just, shaken us out of our stupor in how much, we rely on each other and we rely on these institutions.
Some great points there. I want to thank both Jacob and Anna for sharing their wonderful insights from your research into COVID-19's impact on nonprofits. And then we'll make sure that the listeners and viewers of this have your contact information, website, social media, and links to the report and the research so that they can review it and do a deep dive. There's lots of information there, and get engaged with Candid and support your work. So please stay safe and healthy out there as we work our way through this very strange new normal. That's it for this episode of Voices of the Community. You've been listening to the voices of Jacob Harold, the Executive Vice President, and Anna Koob, the Director of Data Standards of Candid. To provide some context to Anna and Jacob's scenarios that identified a low of 7% to a high of 38% of nonprofits closing down completely, we thought it would be helpful to know how many nonprofits there are, how many people work at nonprofits, and how many jobs have been already lost. There are 1.3 million nonprofit organizations employing roughly 13 million people, which is the third largest workforce in the U.S. economy, overtaking manufacturing by nearly 100,000 workers nationwide in 2017. The nonprofit sector is estimated to be a $200 billion industry that touches the lives of more than 1 in 5 Americans. Anna had mentioned the Johns Hopkins Center for Civil Society. The center's 2020 nonprofit employment report estimated there were 1.6 million job losses from March through May, which rebounded to about 900,000 job losses in their updated November 16th report. This job loss data is before the latest third wave of COVID-19 that has led a majority of states to shut down their economies as hospitals are overwhelmed. The common belief about nonprofits is that a majority of their funding comes from individuals. But according to the National Council of Nonprofits, around 50% of nonprofits' funding comes from billing for services, a third from government contracts and grants, and around 9% from individual donors. With the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, the people who used to donate are now standing in line to receive services, and the local governments that provided contracts and grants are now asking for federal funding grants to just keep their staff and services in place to provide a floor of support for their communities. A common theme we have heard through sharing the voices in the series is that the COVID-19 pandemic has provided an X-ray to all of the core problems in our community, which have been covered over through the services that our nonprofits provide, which we take for granted that they'll always be there, providing what we consider to be the most valuable services in our community, such as social services, arts and culture, recreation, and education. What would happen to our community if our nonprofits were not there for us? With all of this bad news, at the end of 2020, Congress finally came together to pass a stimulus bill with key benefits for nonprofits, including an extension of the temporary charitable deduction available to people who don't itemize their taxes, which allows single people to deduct up to $300 and couples to deduct up to $600. This will hopefully incentivize people to donate to their favorite nonprofits. The stimulus bill also includes another round of forgivable Paycheck Protection Program loans to help nonprofits to keep workers on the payroll and cover some basic overhead. One of the observations of Anna and Jacob's report that really hit home was that, quote, unless government, funders, and nonprofit leaders take immediate and decisive action, many nonprofits around the nation may just disappear over the next few months, leaving those they serve and employ in disastrous circumstances, unquote. Anna and Jacob's State of California analysis scenarios estimate that between 2,600 to 4,200 nonprofits will close their doors because of the COVID-19 pandemic. That would not only be a blow to those who rely on their services, but also do further damage to the economy. Thank you for listening to our series this year. We will continue the series until we get to the other side of the pandemic. As you listen to the many incredible voices in the series, we hope that you will consider the thousands of nonprofits in our community as purpose-driven small businesses owned by the public. Please go to georgecoster.com and click on Voices of the Community and our COVID-19 in San Francisco Nonprofit Series to read Candid's report from Anna and Jacob's team. We hope that you enjoyed the insights, points of view, and personal stories from the voices of changemakers and their nonprofits and small businesses featured in this series. To find out more and get engaged with the nonprofits, small businesses, and staff members featured in the series, please go to my website, georgecoster.com, and click on Voices of the Community to find links to the extended versions of these interviews and to listen to the entire series. After listening to these stories, we hope that you will consider making a donation and volunteering to provide a hand up to your fellow community members. I want to thank my associate producer, Eric Estrada, along with Mel, Lila, Michael, and Laura at the San Francisco Public Press and KSFP. To listen to our next episode in this series and to our archived past shows, which feature community voices working on solutions to critical issues facing Northern California communities, please go to georgecoster.com. While you're on our website, please sign up for our newsletter to find out more about future shows. Please subscribe to Voices of the Community on Apple Podcast, Spotify, and Google Podcast, or wherever you get your podcast. You can follow us on Twitter at George Coster, and we'd love to hear from you with feedback and show ideas. So send us an email to george@georgecoster.com. I'm George Coster in San Francisco, and thank you for listening.